So today's exercise 108 is a little bit different than anything I've done in the past. And I usually saved this strategy or this activity, if we want to call it that, for the end of the semester when we were doing architectural collages. And I've been rethinking it since last semester, and I think it's a lot better to do it earlier in the semester rather than later. And I think it will teach you a lot about kind of analyzing a scene and working in Photoshop and being able to integrate things. So I'm telling you this because when you try something for the first time, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So we're going to kind of experiment together a bit today and see how it goes. But at the same time, I think it's something that will teach you an awful lot about how Photoshop works and how collaging works in Photoshop and being able to put the pieces together. So I'm going to ask you to do two things. We're going to do two different scenes today, one of which is going to be some kind of a streetscape, like the one I have in front of us, and the other one will be some kind of a landscape. And I'll do the landscape one in a little bit. What we're looking for is, I just did a Creative Commons search to find an image, and I typed in empty street as my search term. If you wanted to be more specific, you could say empty street Italy or empty street France or Paris or something, or obviously empty street San Francisco would work just as well. But when we're looking at picking the image, in an ideal sense, we're looking for something with some strong shadow. So this was obviously the one that I picked here that I will ultimately be using. Some of them work better than others. The ones with a true good sun direction tend to be the easiest to integrate. And we can determine that by looking at our image and looking for shadows in this particular image. And so this image is the one I selected. So let's take a little bit of time and analyze this particular image. And when you pick your image for today, you're more than welcome to use the image that I'm using. If you want to use a different image, that's OK too. This is, again, about skill building more than anything else. So if you feel comfortable using the same image, that's perfectly fine with me. I just want to be able to draw on top of this for a little bit. So bear with me for just a second so I can create a brush as part of this analysis. Okay, so if I'm looking at this particular image, right, I have some pretty strong shadows, like right in here and right in here. Okay, and you notice that the shadows originate at a ground point and then go in this direction like that, right? And so they're all following this way, which means that somewhere up over behind the scene over in here is where the sun is, right? And the sun's casting down this direction. So if we were to put, say, a person in the scene like this, right, their shadow would naturally be going this direction, something like that. Does that make sense? I know this is a little bit chunky of a way of looking at it, but sometimes it helps to be able to draw on top of it. The other thing that's relevant when you look at a scene like this is essentially a one-point perspective. So the image is shot looking straight on this particular point. That right there is roughly the vanishing point for this particular image, and all the buildings in this scene, right, go toward the vanishing point. The buildings there go toward the vanishing point. The street lines here go that direction. So this would be a one-point perspective, right, where everything's kind of going in this general direction toward this point, being the one-point perspective. And so when I'm looking at a scene like that, I want to make note of that such that I have kind of a horizon line. So if I look at, and it's hard, if I look at this point coming in here, and I look at this point coming in here, like that, right? This point going there, I'm taking a little bit more time. They kind of meet up at that point. You guys see that? Okay. Likewise, if I were to take the lines of these buildings, it's a little harder because the buildings are different heights. But if I were to kind of come down along the lines of these buildings, right, I'd end up in roughly the same place. Likewise, these light poles here, if I were to come across those light poles, right, if I kept going, I'd end up roughly in that same spot. Okay? By doing something like that, I've established where what's called the vanishing point. Did you guys take 130? Did you talk about constructing perspectives in that class? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. The vanishing point is the point at which all lines in a perspective converge. Okay? It may be a two-point perspective, in which case there might be a vanishing point on one side and then the other, but in this case it's clearly a one-point perspective. They all come to the same point. Okay? So with that, right, what one of the key ways that collaging an image works is that wherever that vanishing point is, and I'll turn it back on for a second, is roughly the eye line of anybody that's walking in the particular scene. So I'm going to drag a little ruler down here that's roughly on where I think the horizon line would be or the vanishing point would be. This line then represents the horizon, right, if I was looking. Now, if we had a scene that wasn't at eye level, this thing totally changes. Right? And I've seen people try to use Google Street View images, but those are shot from much higher because the cameras are up on top of the car, so it doesn't really work using this technique. So we need something that's shot very much at eye level. And it can vary a little bit if the image is looking downhill or it's looking uphill. That's something to be aware of. But generally speaking, if we follow those lines, we have a pretty good idea. The other telltale thing that happens, and I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, right, is we can see that there are some figures way down here at the end of the scene. Do you guys see those a little bit? Right, they're a little bit blurry. If I find out wherever their eye is, wherever their eye level is, that usually matches up with the horizon, assuming that the person that shot the photograph took it from eye level. Right? If I was taking the photograph from down here, right, obviously it doesn't match up with the same perspective. But if I were taking it with eye level, that perspective line should match up. So it's another way of checking. Obviously, I asked for you to pick an image that was relatively devoid of people, as this image is, as a way of kind of having to add something to this particular scene. Okay? So in this particular scene, I've dragged that line down to kind of represent what I believe the horizon line to be is. And now I can bring in people and I can start to integrate them into this scene. And so you guys just spent all of last class isolating people. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the course website. And if I go to Resources and then Collage Images, right, here's the listings of all the posts that you guys have made. And so there's a category called People, there's Animals, there's Objects, there's Landscape, some of which are better than others. And at the bottom here, there is an index. So I'm going to go to the index for just a second, because I think sometimes it's easier to find objects by clicking on a particular search term. And of course, it's running slow. Right? And so when we look here under Actions, we've got a bunch of categories that people have put into place. And so I'm going to go with just walking as a category. And when I click on that, I'm going to get images of people walking that people have categorized. Right? And so as I go down here, I can kind of see there's different ones. Now, we talked about, in Photoshop, the fact that the lighting is coming in this direction. Okay? So if I were to look at a particular person, right, let me create another layer here. If I were to look at a person that was standing, that person's too high, never mind. Hold on, one more. Right? Let's say that person were standing right there in that particular scene. And I were looking at that person, the side of the person that would have light on it would be this side, correct? And the side of the person that would have shadow on it would be over here. Okay? So when I'm looking, and the light would be slightly in front of the person because the shadows are going back and away, and the shadows would be kind of toward the back side of this edge. So as I'm looking for people, right, I want to look at their shadows. So something like this, if I were to look at these images, right, the light is lit okay on this side, but see how the shadow on the face here is coming forward? Right? That means the light was actually slightly behind the person. So it's not quite the right fit for our particular image. So I'm going to keep going, and part of the advantage of having so many of these images is that we can actually kind of analyze, are they working or are they not working? Right? So in this particular case with these two, the light is on the right side, but the shadow, again, the light's a little bit around the front side of them, and the shadow's kind of on the back side. You could maybe make this one work, but it's not quite right. So I'm going to keep going. All right, I'm going to go to the next page here. I'm skipping over some of the ones that are more jagged because I don't need those. Okay, so this one, again, is not bad. I'll open that one in a new tab. And I'm going to keep coming. Go to page 3. Now, I will admit to having looked through these images before, so I know which image I'm looking for. Right? So how about this one? And actually, this one's not too bad either. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. If I looked at this image, right there, the shadows, right, are falling very nicely. Now, don't be fooled by this shadow, because it's the shadow of the girl on the guy. Okay? But as we look at this, we've got nice highlights on this side, so we've got nice shadows on this side. And the shadow isn't particularly, it's not coming off of his head, so we know that the light is behind them, shining toward them. Does that kind of make sense? Right? So I'm paying a lot of attention to matching up the people with the scene so that the lighting conditions work. Now, if it was close, right, this one's not too bad either. Right? Same thing. The lighting conditions are on this side of the person. Right? The shadows are behind. You kind of get a sense for that. So that one would work nicely too. If it was this one, for example, and the shadows are close, we might be able to do a little bit of work to this person to adapt it. Right? The other thing that can happen is sometimes the light could be correct, but it could be just coming from the opposite side. Right? And I should probably keep looking for one that's coming from the opposite side. Sometimes you have to keep scrolling. Yeah, okay, so let's see this one for a second. Okay, so now in this one, right, if we look at her, let me get the color version, hopefully. If we look at her, right, her face is in shadow, okay, and the light's coming from this side, okay? Now, in this particular instance, it wouldn't work natively in my scene, but if I took this image and I flipped it, it would work in all likelihood. So you don't always have to have it perfect when you pick the image. You just have to have the light coming from the right direction. So I'll use this one as an example in a little bit as well. So let's jump back to Photoshop and let's start looking at inserting people. So obviously all of these layers are my little example layers, so you won't have these, but we can just safely ignore them for right now. So let me go ahead and put somebody in the scene. I'm going to go to File and then Place as a way of getting my image into the scene. And so I'll start with the couple that are walking here. And I'm going to start with them because the lighting conditions almost perfectly match my scene, so it's a good place to start. Okay? And again, when you're doing this, if you don't feel comfortable yourself in how you're picking it or whatever, you can follow my lead, right? Pick the same streetscape, pick the same image for practice. Okay? So obviously, these two don't belong in the scene the way they are because they're way too big. Right? They look like giants walking in the scene. So first thing that I need to do is I need to shrink them down. And by its nature, when we place an image in Photoshop, one with a transparent background like this, it gives us a bounding box and it gives us little corners. Right? If I move to this upper corner and I drag, right, I can make these people smaller so that they start to fit in the scene. Now, I don't want to skew them so that they're in the wrong proportion. They're either too skinny or too fat. But what I do want is I want to hold down Shift as I scale, which is going to keep them roughly or exactly in proportion. Okay? So now as I look at these two people, okay, the guy is a little bit taller than the girl in this particular case, but I want their kind of average of their eyes to be roughly at that horizon line that I already drew. Okay? Once I have it roughly there, wherever I place them in the scene, right, they'll feel like they fit at the right scale. Okay? Furthermore, okay, if I were to shrink them smaller this way, and I keep their eyes at the same place, see how they feel like they're deeper into the scene? Right? I could take them even smaller as long as I put their eyes there, and now they feel like they're much further into the scene. Do you guys see how that works? Okay? If it wasn't right at the horizon, if I didn't have that line kind of guiding me, it would be very easy to say, oh, I want them to be deeper in the scene, and I place them something like that. But see how they seem way too tall now? And it takes a little bit of practice to really see this, right? But with a little bit of practice, you will get there. So I want them to come a little bit more into the foreground, and I'm going to place them such that they're standing right about there, in the middle of this scene, and then I have this nice space here that I can go ahead and cast my shadows. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and when I'm done with this placement, I'm going to check this box, this little check box here that says Commit to the Transform. There it is. And now I have these two people that are floating in the scene. I can hide, if I go to View, Show, and I uncheck Guides, I can hide that horizon line, so now we can actually see what these people look like. So in terms of how they fit in scale and proportion, they're fitting into the scene pretty well. Okay? But wouldn't you say that they're still floating a bit in the scene? If we look down at their feet, there's nothing that ties them into the scene. They don't feel like they're part of this scene yet. So now it's time to start really playing around with how do we make them seem like they're part of this scene. Okay? So you guys remember last class I asked you to create those gray images as well. Right? There's always method to my madness. Right? So let me go ahead and go back, and I'm going to place in that gray image. So I downloaded that as well, and I'll go ahead and place it. Now I have to spend a little bit of time with the Shift key here to make these two images line up. Oops. All right, and they're getting there. Make them a little bit bigger. I'm not overly worried that they're exactly spot on, but I want them to be fairly close to the right size. So they're reasonably close right now. And I'll go ahead and commit to it as well. Okay? So now I have the people that are gray, and I have just the regular people. Okay? Now, in all likelihood, the gray is going to end up behind the people, but I'm going to leave them on top for right now. Okay? So we know that the shadows are going off to the left and back in the scene. So I want these gray people to become shadows rather than the people themselves. Okay? So I'm going to use a command that's up here under the Edit menu, and it's under Transform, and it's called Skew. Okay? There is a command called Perspective that you can work with as well. I don't recommend Perspective until you get very, very comfortable with Photoshop. I think Skew is a little bit easier because it constrains how you can move particular objects. So I'm going to work with Edit, Transform, and then Skew. And when I do Edit, Transform, and then Skew, you see that I get the same bounding box that I was scaling with before. The difference is that when I click and move on these corner points, right, my images start to adjust or skew. Okay? So I'm going to start to move these images, and it takes practice to know which direction to move them. Right? And so if, for example, and let me go ahead and put this, the two, it's not going to let me change the layers yet. Obviously, this is going to go behind the people. But if my shadows were going like this, it doesn't integrate with the scene because they don't match up to the direction of the shadows. So part of the reason I like this as an early experiment into integrating is we can see the shadows are really strong. So it's easy to match up. So I'm going to keep working with these corners until these start to feel like they're more part of the scene. Now they need to be a little bit longer here. And one of the things that works very nicely with the Skew tool is you're limited in how you can move and how you can manipulate these particular objects. So let me zoom in a little bit on just the shadow. Right? And if I look at this angle here, it's not quite right. I need to keep working it, and I need to get the angle a little bit more down that way. Right? And we'll work with this side as well. This might need to come up a little bit. Now, I'm trying to look with where the feet match up, right? Because, let me just move this down a little bit, right? We see that there's one foot, there's the other foot, right? Likewise, I have 2 feet there. So I want the feet to roughly line up, right? Looks like I need them to work their way over a little bit more. Now let's see if we can move them up. Okay, that's starting to feel a little bit better there. something like that. And let's move that over a little bit. And so the lines here of the people are starting to match up very nicely with the lines here, right, in the shadows. So let me go ahead and commit to it for right now. Okay, so there's my little shadows. And let me go ahead and put my people in front. Right? So we look at her feet. Those line up rather nicely. His feet aren't quite right because this needs to go this second. Let's zoom in a little bit. Right? This second shadow is a little bit past where I need it to be. Okay? So I might go back again and go back to my Edit, Transform, Skew. Now, oops, wrong. Sorry, wrong object. Edit, Transform, Skew. Right? And there's no doubt that this is going to take some practice for you to get right. All right, so let's see. This is probably going to have to come over a little bit more. Like that. Okay, so now we're roughly matching up with where those shadows are. Right? And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be close enough to be believable. So let me go back to there. Okay? So the shadows are starting to look like these people belong in the scene. Wouldn't you agree? Okay? Now the problem is, if I look at this, right, the shadows are just gray. If I look at the shadows here, see how they're just darkening the surroundings. Okay? Well, you guys already have the tools to transform this into a shadow, and that is that I'm going to take this gray and change the blending mode to multiply, which is going to cause the stuff that's underneath the shadow to shine through. Now when I do that, I press Control-0, these shadows look a lot darker than these other shadows. Okay, so I need to adjust the opacity here of the shadows until they match up with the shadows in the scene. And so in that case, that would be a little too light. Right, something like about there is probably pretty good. Okay? So I was able to make these people feel like they belong in the scene because I put shadows underneath them. So right where their feet are landing, they're casting shadows off in this direction, and the shadows match up with the existing shadows in the scene. Right? Now there is a subtle thing about this shadow versus that shadow that bugs me. It's probably beyond the scope of what you need to worry about, but the tone of this shadow is a little bit more yellow than the tone of this shadow. Right? So personally, I would go in and I would add an adjustment layer on top of my shadow. So I'd go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I do a Hue and Saturation adjustment. And I want this not to apply to the photo. I want it to just apply to the layer directly below it. So I'm going to press Control-Alt-G, which is going to tie this layer directly to that layer. And then I'm going to skew the color blue and skew the saturation forward a little bit. And on the projector, you're probably not going to be able to see, but I was able to make that shadow match up with this shadow. Right? It's a little bit more blue. If we were to look without the background at just the shadow, let me make it's at 63%, so I can come back. It's a little bit more blue. It's hard for you guys to see on the projector, but let me go back to 63%. It's just my way of kind of tying those much better into the scene to make sure that the colors match. But again, it's probably beyond what you need to worry about for right now. But since I'm here showing you, I wanted to at least show you that. Okay? So these people feel like they're part of the scene now. Now, they may be a little bit bright for the exposure level of this particular scene. They may stand out a little bit. I can adjust that a little bit using a dodge and a burn if I wanted to. So let me go ahead and do, on top of the people one layer, I'm going to do a new, just a regular layer. And I'll say OK. Oops. Layer, new layer. It's going to be overlay, fill with a 50% gray. And that needs to go up on top of this. And once again, I want it to only apply to the people. So I press Control-Alt-G, and I get that little arrow. That just ties the layers together. And then I can use my dodge and my burn tools just like we did previously. Make this a little bit smaller. All right. And I could selectively darken them a little bit if I wanted to. I could also selectively lighten that edge if I wanted to, just a bit. So depending on what you're trying to do, you can tweak the lighting conditions just a little bit. And that may or may not be particularly obvious on the projector. Yeah, it's a little bit, as a way of kind of further integrating them into the scene. Okay? So I was able to add these people relatively easily. I'm asking as part of this exercise that you do this to a scene and put people in. But I want to point out something else, and that is that I run into a problem with some areas in the scene, specifically right here with the curb. So what happens if I had somebody that was casting a shadow across the curb? Right? So let's come back and let's bring another image into this scene. Okay, we talked about using her as an image. So let's go ahead and I'm going to save this image, if it'll let me. There we go. And again, I want the gray version, because I'm going to use that as well. Oh, looks like we have some extra. I'm going to have to deal with that. Save that as well. Perfect. Because of that image with the problem, I'm going to go ahead and open this separately so that I can chop off that extra piece. Let me go into crop. It's easier to do it as its own separate file than to have to do it in the scene itself. Could you set up a mask for it? Sure, but it's just too much work. So I'm going to make sure that that gets clipped off before I use it. And we'll go ahead and save it. All right, so let me go back to the scene, and I'm going to once again go to File and then Place, and I'm going to start with this girl. Okay, and let's go ahead and shrink her down a little bit. Right. Again, the eye needs to be at about the same level. Right. And we'll pull her over here so that she's stepping kind of off that curb a little bit. I think she's a little bit shorter. I think she needs to be a little shorter. Right, like about like that. Okay, so she's walking across. Now, obviously, when she casts her shadow, it's going to intersect with that curb, which is going to be a problem. So we'll go ahead and do it. But remember that her lighting conditions were opposite of what we wanted. So I actually need to flip her across. So we can go ahead and commit to the transform. And then I'm going to go up to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to go to Flip Horizontal. And now she's going to be going the right direction. I have the light in the correct direction. Okay? So I wanted to make sure I corrected that first. And obviously she's walking in this direction right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring in her shadow. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll bring in the shadow. Once again, I need to make it smaller, but I also need to flip the shadow. So let me go to Transform and Flip Horizontal. There we go. And I need the two of them to line up nicely. So remember, I'm holding down Shift. And I've got them reasonably close now. Okay? So I'll go ahead and say OK and commit to it. And now once again, on the shadow, I need to use the Transform and then Skew tool to work her shadow into the same And I know it takes time to get used to kind of how this works. But part of the reason that I like the skew is it's much easier to just keep working each side, and eventually you get the right orientation. Okay, so let's have a look here. Let me zoom in so that we're seeing her a little bit better. That. All right, so it looks like the shadow still needs to go down a little bit more. Right? Now this is a little bit deceiving because I've got the curb in the way. Okay, so I have to think of her shadow just at the ground level, not up where the curb is. Okay, because we're ultimately going to have to wrap her shadow around the object here. Okay, so that's roughly getting to about the right shadow position if it were a flat ground, not where this curb is. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that her feet line up again. Right, so we need to make sure that that lines up. Looks like this needs to go down a little bit more. Like that. Okay, her feet are lining up fairly well. Right, the shadow's reasonably the right length, so I'm okay with it. Okay, so what I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and commit to it, and there it is. I can, of course, switch into multiply mode, and it starts to darken the ground. But I'm not going to worry about that just yet. And now I need to actually make some modifications to the shadow. So if we look at the shadows, right, the shadow comes along and then goes up straight and then keeps going. Okay? So effectively, I need to find where that transition, where it starts to go straight, right, which is roughly right about there. Okay, right through the middle of her. Now, I can't do anything because this is still a referenced image file. It's still a placed image. And I can tell that because of this little icon right here. And thus far, I haven't worried about it. I've been comfortable with leaving it as a referenced image. But now I have to actually work with this image a bit. So I'm going to right-click on the image. Oops. And of course, it's not going to do it. Sorry. I'm going to right-click on the text of the layer, and I'm going to say Rasterize Layer. Okay? And you see that that little icon goes away. Okay? Now I can actually start to work with the layer. So I'll use this polygonal lasso tool up here, and I'm going to draw a line that goes right along the seam of the street. So we know the street goes all the way up there. I'm going to do it right to there. And then I'm going to just drag around, or excuse me, click around the rest of the image. Okay? So I made a little selection with a slice right there where the transition is going to be. Okay? Now I'm going to use the Move tool up here in the upper left corner, and I'm going to move this. Notice that my cursor now has a little pair of scissors attached to it. I'm going to move this straight up, and I can hold down Shift to do that, so that it falls on the upper part of the curve. Okay? So now I have the shadow up above and the shadow down below. The part that I'm missing is the transition in between. So this is relatively easy. Once again, I'm going to use the polygonal lasso. Right? I'm going to start right there. I'm going to go straight up to that corner, straight back down to this corner, and select it. So now I have a little selection that represents that part of the shadow. Okay? Now I need to paint, with the paintbrush tool, the same color gray as this. So I'll use, just because I'm not sure that it is exactly the same color that is the 75% gray, I didn't do it. I'm going to use this little eyedropper tool to pick the color of the gray, and you see that I get it as my color now. And then we'll go back to the brush, and I'm going to paint this in. Okay? So now my shadow goes over and then up and then over the way it should. Let me zoom out a little bit, and we can start to see that, yeah, it looks approximately like it should. Okay? So let's go ahead and switch to multiply. And now the shadow, we can see through the shadow. It's still a little bit dark, right? So let me go, once again, we'll drop that shadow down. Last time 63% worked pretty well, right? And lo and behold, it works pretty well. So now we have this set of shadows, but we also have her shadow being cast onto the ground here. It looks like maybe I was slightly off in my perspective. It needs to swing a little bit more for the light to be perfectly accurate, but it's reasonable. Okay? And so now she feels like she's part of the scene the same way that they feel like they're part of the scene. Okay? So you can see that I was able to make these adjustments rather easily because I've done the shadows below. Okay, so now I'm done. I'll go ahead and save this, and we'll put it into today's scene, and I'll go ahead and save it as a Photoshop file. You will save it as a Photoshop file, but also as a JPEG image so that it can come out as a JPEG image. Okay, so now we did the urban context, and I started with the urban scene because streets are really easy to put a shadow on, right? They're flat surfaces. What if, instead of that, I open up a scene, it's maybe something like this. Okay? It's going to be a little bit more challenging to integrate somebody into this scene. But I can tell, again, by looking at this scene, that I have these trees and they're casting a shadow, again, from the right side, right, toward the left. But this time, it's a little bit further into the scene, and the shadows are coming slightly back at us. Okay? If I didn't like that image, I could also pick, I downloaded several different images. This one, for example, has shadows coming almost in the same direction as the other scene. So we could do it out of this scene as well. Right? Either one works. Right? We'll start with this one because that was the one I initially picked. Okay, so as we look at this scene again, and I'm going to draw on top of it as I did last time, so that we can kind of analyze it. Okay, this scene is much further away in its perspective, right? The last one was kind of close up, but we can assume that there's kind of a horizon line that's roughly right about there. Right? It might be a little bit closer to the actual edge. It can be hard in these kinds of nature scenes because hills mask where a true horizon is, but it's roughly about there. And chances are, because of all these trees on this side, our general perspective, our view corridor is going more that direction. So if I were going to put somebody in the scene, putting them here and standing would be a little bit better than putting them over here. Okay? And then the shadows are going to come slightly this way from that particular scene. Right? Here's my little person. Okay? So let's see if we can't integrate into this scene. So I'm going to go to File and then Place once again. And I can actually use the same images that I used before. But let's pick a different scene. Let me go back and just, in the interest of making these unique, let's see if we can find another one that looks good. Let's use this one. Okay. Again, the shadows on the correct side, we've got a little bit more shadow in the front of her, which I think will work nicely because of the direction of the scene. So let's go ahead and find the color version. There's the color version. And I'm going to go ahead and save this person. Let me save image as. And then I'm going to go back, and I want the gray. There's the gray. Save image as. Oops, that was. Save image as, and we'll save that as well. Okay, so let me come back into Photoshop, and I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Place. And we'll work with my woman walking. Okay. And so again, I didn't drag down where I thought the horizon line would be, but let's say that I drag it down. It should be roughly about there. It's not going to let me put it in anyway. So her eyes need to be about there, and let's make her a little bit bigger. Maybe something like that. Yeah, right about there. Okay? So I'm putting her more in the foreground so that she's a little bit larger so that you can see what's happening. In a scene like this, it's hard because unless the image is right in front, they get really, really small. Right? Obviously, she could be way back here in the scene, and we could integrate her there. But that wasn't what I wanted. So let's try that again. Let's go to File, Place. And let's drop her in a little bit closer. Yeah, right about there. Okay. So once again, I need to bring in the shadow. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll bring in the shadow. There we go. And I have to transform that shadow down a little bit. Close enough. Okay. So I'll go ahead and commit to that. Now this time, the shadow is coming slightly toward us. Okay. So when I go to my Edit, Transform, Skew, right, we're ultimately going to be moving the shadow so that it's facing toward us. And now, in this context, see how her boot is up off the ground because she's taking a step? I can't quite line up the shadow, right, spot on to where her boot is because it's up off the ground a little bit. So it'll involve a little bit more tweaking. Like that. Right, about like that. This probably needs to get skewed over a little bit. All right, so that's not too bad. So I'll go ahead and commit to it. And so in this case, the shadows are very thin. We can tell that this is a pretty wide tree, but if we look at the shadow, it's pretty thin. Okay, so having a thin shadow is kind of to be expected. I'm going to take her shadow and I'm going to make it multiply so that it shines through a little bit. And in this context, the shadows are pretty dark. So I might end up duplicating this layer. I'm right-clicking to say Duplicate so that the shadow gets a little bit darker. So in the last one, I had to lighten it. This time, I'm trying to darken it. Right? Might not be quite to, so maybe it's something like about there. Okay? And now if we look at the scene, we've got one other problem. Okay? So if I look really closely at her feet, right, she still looks like she's floating a little bit. Well, it looks like I need to move the shadows a little bit tighter to her feet. So that's part of the problem there. Okay. But she still looks like she's floating a little bit, and that's because she's on top of a natural grass-like substance. Okay? And if you're on top of a grass-like substance, when you put your foot down, it sinks into the grass, correct? So we can't see a sharp edge along her shoe. It's just not, it's not fair. Okay? So we need to find a way to compensate for that. Right? So this part gets a little bit more challenging, but we're going to use something that's a tool coupled with kind of a layer structure. Okay? So the first thing that I need is I need a copy of the background that I can work with. Okay? So let me go ahead and I'll create, just with the polygonal lasso, right, a little box around where my objects are. Okay? Notice that I included the shadow and her feet in this little box. Okay? I'm going to make sure background is selected, and then I'm going to go up to Edit, Copy, and then once again Edit, Paste. Okay? So what happened is that I ended up with an extra little piece of ground that's floating on top of the background. We can't tell that it's there, but there's an extra little piece. Okay? If, however, I move this extra piece on top of the woman, and we turn her on, oops, we can see that this piece is now blocking off parts of her feet. Okay? So let me go ahead and fine-tune this a little bit. Okay? So let me turn this off, and let me turn off everything except for her in color. We'll turn off the background, and we'll turn this on. And I'm actually going to move this slightly down in the layer stack for a second so that it's below her feet. I want to be able to cut this shape out in the shape of her feet for right now. Okay? So let me go ahead, and I'll use my Magic Wand tool, right here, to select the back, oops, I need to be on this layer, to select the background around this lady. Okay? Then, with that selected, I'll move to my layer with the grass on it, and I'm going to select inverse, and then I'll press delete, which essentially causes her little feet to get cut out. Right? I can do the same thing with the shadow here. So I'll use Magic Wand again on the shadow layer. I'll select everything and then do an inverse so that I can cut out where the shadow is. Okay? And I know it's a little strange, right, to be doing this, but remember when I turn back on the background, it doesn't look like anything's happened. Okay? But I have this nice little creative piece of cutout to work with. So let me go ahead and turn back on. I'm going to move this extra piece of ground all the way to the top. We'll turn back on, right, my options here, my woman. And now I'm going to use something called the clone stamp tool. Okay, so I'm on, this is my, let's call this cutout, just for clarity. I'm going to use this tool. It looks like kind of a rubber stamp. Okay, and what this does is it copies from one place and puts it in another place. But I also want to specify a particular type of brush, and it's called the grass brush. It's down here. It's brush number 134, right there. The 134 is the size of it, but it looks like 3 little prongs. Right? And what that does is it gives me, and let me make my brush a little bit bigger. It gives me a little piece of what looks like grass. Okay? So with the clone stamp tool on, this is too big, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and that's going to make a place that I can copy from. And then I'm going to move over her foot and make some grass. Make this a little bit smaller here, such that her foot feels like it's now part of the grass. You guys see how I kind of did that? Okay. This foot, there's not a whole lot I can do. However, the edge here of the shadow, I need to put a little bit of grass on that. So again, I'll hold down Alt as a point to copy from, and we'll put just a little bit of grass on the edge of this shadow, because the shadow couldn't actually be perfectly, right? The grass would mask part of that shadow. Okay? So I've covered up part of that edge with the grass, and I've covered up her foot. So if I were to turn back on the background, it already looks like she's much more part of the scene than she was. Okay? So let's turn that off again, and I'm now going to work just on the shadow. Right? And I'm actually going to get rid of one of these shadows for now, for clarity purposes here. Okay? So I have just the gray shadow. And on the back side of the gray shadow, once again, I'm going to use that clone stamp tool. But I'm going to clone stamp. Oh, I'm going to have to rasterize this layer. Let me right-click and say Rasterize Layer to the shadow. And then I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to copy again, but this time from the gray. And we'll make this a little bit smaller. And we're going to fuzz the back edge of this gray. Oops. And one of the challenges with clone stamping is that you constantly have to reset the point that you're copying from. So I'm constantly resetting it to over here where I have a little bit more space, because if I were to keep going, at some point I would run out of copy. Right? It's transparent over here, and you can actually see the little cursor following me. That's what it's copying from. So we'll keep resetting and holding down Alt, and we'll work our way along this edge. Okay, unfortunately, it copied a little bit down there. I may need to go back with the eraser and kind of clean those little extra bits off. Okay, so it's reasonable. Now I've got that little bit. Oh, I need a little bit more in the back here. Clone stamp, Alt, copy from, and we'll just, kind of fuzz that just a little bit. Okay, maybe a little bit too much. Take a little bit more out. Okay. So now, if we turn this back on, right, we see that I have a little bit of fuzz on that side. If we turn the cutout on, we see that I have some fuzz on the front side. Okay. And let me drop this right there. There. Oops. Sorry. And then let's go and make sure that the cutout is on multiply, or excuse me, this is on multiply. Good. And so I have a little bit of a problem in that my cutout isn't letting the grass shine through. The shadow isn't quite working correctly. So let me go back to my cutout, and I'm going to make one more modification. And that is that I'm going to delete this upper part because I don't need it. So I could use just the eraser tool here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to get rid of that there. Don't have to worry about all of it. Remember, it fills back in. Okay? And let's go ahead and turn the shadow back on. Let's turn the background back on. Merchant on. And cutout should be in front of the shadow there. And now, when we go to Control 0, this shadow starts to have the rough edges as if it were actually in the grass. Okay? So I recognize that this is hard. Right? There's a reason that this is at the end of the chain of what I showed you. Right? You start with, I say on the sheet that you can actually start with either one. I would start with the urban scene on a regular street because it's going to be a lot easier initially. But I wanted to show you how you can make this person feel like they're part of this scene as well. Okay? So if you get through the urban scene and you feel comfortable, time to start trying to tackle this. Right? It's using all the same techniques. The only thing that's different is the clone stamp tool. That's the one new thing that we threw in today. Okay? But it's essentially all the same technique. Oh, the skew as well. Okay? Are there any questions? No? I know it's a lot to take in, right? But this is all part of learning. Okay? I'll turn you loose.